All right. Thanks everybody for coming today. We're so glad to have you here. So this is the Great Plains Conservation Network. This is our webinar series that we try and do every sort of winter and early spring while people are hopefully not out in the field, and we can kind of connect with all the different work that's happening across the Great Plains. That's the mandate of GPCN, is sort of looking at these large landscape ideas and trying to connect people who are all passionate about conservation in all the different corners of the Great Plains, from Canada all the way down to Mexico. So a lot of you might already be getting our newsletter. And then these webinars is another great place to, find out what people who are maybe not in your silos, in your areas, are doing, and learn from their work. So I'm so excited to introduce Lindsey Sterling Krank today. She's the Humane World for Animals Program Director for Prairie Dog Conflict Resolution. She's also on our GPCN steering committee and the co-chair of our Prairie Dog Working Group, who's been doing really incredible work with the Homes on the Range project, which they're working on rolling out right now. And she was on the ground last summer at the Conata Basin emergency response. And we're really grateful to her for sharing her knowledge with us today. So take it away, Lindsey.
Thank you, Lindsay. I gave this presentation, but a more abridged version in January with Travis Livieri, one of my colleagues with Prairie Wildlife Research, and really him and his partners, or he and his partners, are very responsible for black-footed ferret reintroduction being successful on the ground in Conata Basin. So a lot of these information and some of these slides came from him too, and I just wanted to acknowledge that today as well. All right, so Conata Basin is a very special place. It's just so unique. If any of you have been there, it's in the southwest corner of South Dakota, and it's, next door to Badlands National Park, and it's really Badlands, which are just this crazy unique feature that we find in the West, and interspersed with some really good grassland habitat and the most important prairie dog colony and black-footed ferret reintroduction site in the world. So this is where we got to work a lot. I just wrapped up a 3-year project there. So this is a photo from this last season. One of the reasons it's so special is because it's home to these super wonderful black-footed ferrets, and they are known as the most endangered mammal in North America. 250 of the world's wild population of black-footed ferrets live in Conata Basin. There's an estimated 495 total worldwide. So, and I'm talking about in the wild. So that just really estimates or really highlights how important it is in Conata Basin for these black-footed ferrets. It's the most sustainable ferret population also. 34 different sites have had reintroduction attempts, and Conata Basin is the only one that doesn't have to be augmented every year. We estimate that we need about 3,000 adult ferrets range wide to delist them. And that ends up looking like 30 different sites with about 100 breeding adults. Conata Basin has 92 breeding adults as of 2024. And it's been a 30-year Herculean effort. So they were once thought to be extinct, and bringing them back to this point to get these 92 individuals back here, and also peppered throughout their range. But in Conata Basin has been decades of hard work, innovation, and millions of dollars. And supporting them all and holding the whole reintroduction effort up, the associated species population efforts up, are thousands of acres of black-tailed prairie dogs. And yes, they're super cute, but they're also a keystone species, the middle of the food chain, imperiled, in decline, and in demand for black-footed ferrets. In the Conata Basin, Badlands National Park area that we're kind of talking about, we have about 17,500 acres of prairie dogs that are prime habitat, key ferret areas, and about 12,500 acres of those are where we can kind of find our ferrets on interspersed throughout the area. So what do we know? What are we talking about? We are talking about plague. It's a non-native disease. It was introduced into the ports in the 1940s and it really came over from Asia. And it's just been kind of the ports where it came from was really the West Coast and San Francisco. And it's just been kind of slowly moving east ever since then. I actually discovered the first plague epizootic in Conata Basin in 2008, and it was devastating. We had, had 300 ferrets in the wild there. We had it, really thriving and sustainable and going. And it really was a sad day just to see these dead prairie dogs above ground and realize that, oh my gosh, this is what's happening on the ground. How are we going to stop this? And then, plague kind of continued to pepper up throughout the ground for the next 5 or 6 years. We had a really strong response then as well, but we just didn't get to the amount of acres that we are able to get to now. So after plague kind of petered out, we had it managed. We hadn't seen any more, no evidence of plague since 2016. These last, 8 to 9 years have been hard fought to really get our population and our numbers back up to, we had 330 black-footed ferrets we introduced and about 35,000 acres of prairie dogs in our heyday. And since then, back in 2024, right before plague was discovered again, we had about 200 ferrets in the wild and about 20,000 acres of prairie dogs. So getting there, but it was a long decade of repair and rebound that many people contributed to. Each year we get to about 5,000 acres of plague management on Conata Basin. And in 23, like I said, we mapped 17,500 acres of prairie dogs. And this is Travis's word for the year, and I did have to press how do you play this, but it's recrudescence, a renewed outbreak of disease in extended use. It most often describes the return of an undesirable condition, such as a war or a plague, or the return of an undesirable idea. And that's certainly what many of prairie biologists and grassland biologists working on prairie dogs and ferrets would feel like and describe plague. It's something we fear and manage for. And many of my non-lethal funding used to go almost just to all sorts of cool conservation activities. And now we're trying to figure out how to keep prairie dogs alive and manage plague. So it's a big threat on the landscape. Typically we get to about treating about 50% of what's on the ground as far as occupied acres go. You can see in 2008, that's really when we discovered plague for the first time. We didn't have that many acres of prairie dogs. So going and getting, as we were building back up, we were able to get a higher percentage of burrows treated. But typically, once the burrows kind of leveled out and we got so big, we were able to treat about 50% of the acres occupied by prairie dogs every year to mitigate for plague, which means when I'm saying treating these acres, I'm mostly talking about dusting with deltamethrin, which is an insecticide which kills fleas on prairie dogs and in the burrow. So this year, when we got to Conata Basin, we started our field season. It was literally about this time 12 months ago. How did we know that we had a problem on the ground? What looked different? Well, in this picture, you can see prairie dogs on these burrows. And really what it looks like is in this picture, you see no prairie dogs on these burrows. Travis and Prairie Wildlife Research started their work and saw about 2 prairie dogs that were above ground and had perished. Those both tested for plague positive, and those areas were 10 miles apart from each other on the landscape. They did have other colonies looking normal with high reproduction, but that's a sure sign. Dead prairie dogs above ground, not predated upon. That's when your stomach drops, your heart drops, and your stomach drops. Sorry about the slides moving forward on its own. Not sure why it's doing that. But what's really at risk? So what are we really talking about that we need to deal with? Well, most black-footed ferrets are trapped every year and vaccinated, but the kits are not. They're too young, they're too small, so they're really just completely vulnerable, and fleas could transmit plague to them right away. We knew that we had those 5,000 acres that we've been getting to every year, contracted for 24, but that dusting crew was going to take a few months to complete that dusting, and that the colonies could continue to collapse before our dusting can get there. So really the question became, how do we protect the maximum number of black-footed ferrets? And this is really what we were finding and seeing above ground. Ultimately, overall, we ended up locating 30 plus prairie dog carcasses on 8 different colonies. We had those 2 that had tested plague positive, but by this point, after you have a positive plague test and you're continuing to see the same symptoms, no testing further was conducted, and that's par for the course, I would say. And now we're seeing that plague is really reemerging simultaneously across the area, taking into account that the potential for catastrophic black-footed ferret loss is high, and that the regular 2024 mitigation would not be fast enough or enough range-wide, cover enough territory. And this is what we're talking about. This is the map of the area, and we'll kind of stick with a map of the area for the next few slides. But all right, so the light orange, that's prairie dogs. How many prairie dogs we had before the first plague epizootic was discovered in 2008. And then the dark orange is what we had been able to recover and what prairie dogs had reoccupied. What is that? I mean, almost over the last 15, 20 years. So that's really what we're dealing with, is these dark orange spots. The light orange had not been reoccupied yet. Specifically, if you're looking at this same map, but with these black dots, you're seeing this is where we have our major black-footed ferret areas. This is where we had spotted plague in 3 of these spots. And this is our number or quantity of black-footed ferrets that were in this site. So we had 39 over there in Agate. We had 17 in Conata, and only 5 remaining prairie dogs is what that blue bubble says in the bottom left at Heck Table. And they had upwards of 20 to 30 black-footed ferrets. All right, so we're looking at how are we going to do this? How are we going to get the most burrows treated, save the most prairie dogs, and therefore the most black-footed ferrets on the ground, so that we can keep our reintroduction site going and keep our prairie dogs and their associates on the ground. So we decided to contract the dusting crew to the best black-footed ferret areas first. And then the second crew was really where we came in. We started, reaching out to the colleagues, or Travis started reaching out to the colleagues and saying, hey, I'm going to need help. This one crew is not going to be enough. We have, hundreds of thousands of acres in the Buffalo Gap National Grassland that we need to treat. What can you do? We needed a third crew, which became the Prairie Wildlife crew. They do their regular spotlighting, and that they could be capturing black-footed ferrets as planned, and then spot treating around those areas as they were working in those areas. And then, right, so that's exactly what I just said. The spotlighting to vax black-footed ferrets and direct spot treat dusting. And then prairie dog reconnaissance to identify normal colonies and colonies that were collapsing or had collapsed, so we knew where to focus our efforts. And then ultimately, this new strategy became part of the effort to mitigate plague in 2024 was let's do translocation. We had been already out there for the last 2 years trying to just study, is translocation worth it? Is it working? Can we upscale translocation to make it more replicable on larger landscapes? So we were already planned to come out and collect data for our 3rd year. And this time, Travis just said, we have a new crisis. We need to translocate as many as possible. Let's figure out what data we can collect to keep our research going. But really, we need to get prairie dogs out of these boundary management zones and back into these key ferret areas as much as possible. So we gathered the troops and got to work and started training. And we all had to take a ATV safety course for a couple days and get certified to drive ATVs on public lands. We also had to take a pesticide applicator's license test. So that was fascinating in all these tiny little counties in South Dakota. And then we started a major planning effort for what translocation and dusting would look like. This is my team. There's a little bit of USGS peppered in here too, but a lot of these other teams were already on the ground and also came from Badlands National Park, the Forest Service, and Prairie Wildlife Research. So yes, this was a lot of coordination. This is what the field looked like each day out there. This was the second crew. So we have the contract crew that's out there and dusting all the time. This is what the second crew looks like. And then we would all have these regular coordination calls gosh, they might have been every week. I can't remember if they were every week or every other week, but every week, I'm pretty sure, we would get on the call, and all the organizers would get on their call, and we would figure out how many acres we had dusted, where we were getting to the right spots, how many acres had the crew dusted, where were the active colonies, where had we been reporting inactive colonies, and where did we need to focus our efforts? What was remaining? Did we have enough people to do it? Could they be housed? Where would they be housed? Did they have enough ATVs and equipment? So it was really just a her like Herculean effort again. And that dust, which you can see in those piles or in those boxes and that piled in the middle of that trailer, there was a giant, trailer of dust that at one point even got lost somewhere in the West and wasn't delivered. So we had to get a second order. So that took a long time. So of course, all the regular flaws that occur in a big project and plan, played out too. Travis kept us updated with these circles, which is where we had known prairie dogs as of this year, and as of in 2024, and then we could focus our efforts on those being the priority too. We had our carcasses or our dead prairie dogs marked by this plus sign, and that helped us focus our efforts too. The red is everything that had been lost. The green was active. And the red colonies ended up becoming about 2,000, this is, I think, a little bit over 2,000 acres, ultimately that we lost. So those are results of the mitigation efforts. We really amped up these efforts as I've been discussing. I work for Humane World for Animals, and I was very grateful to my supervisors, Jen and John, for letting me get out there and organize our crew and kind of shift and say, hey, this is where we've been working on our work and our efforts and our research for the last few years. And now, these animals that we've been studying and protecting are imperiled. Can we pivot and do this? And I was very grateful for that yes from them. So Humane World for Animals gets a big thank you. Prairie Wildlife Research, as always, Forest Service, Badlands National Park, World Wildlife Fund, Defenders of Wildlife, USGS, all these folks are out there on the regular in these super hot days, starting work sometimes at 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning, so that by the time the sun came up, we could really be going and not dying from heat exhaustion by the end of the day. June through August, plague was spotted in mid to late May, confirmed in late May. So June through August was really our biggest efforts. We got to 11,300 acres dusted. We applied Fitbits, which are not totally approved by the FDA. So it's still a research permit. So we could only do 2,200 acres of that, but it's a great alternative, and it's good to diversify your pest management portfolio anyways. Super grateful to Randy Matchett and Turner Endangered Species Fund for helping us get on the ground and put the Fitbits out. We did spotlight June through August, but it was limited. I think spotlighting occurs more in the fall typically. And the translocation crew was starting to get on the ground too, mapping our colonies, laying traps and pre-bait, and dusting our take and release sites for translocation. And then in the fall, the kind of second part of the field season, we finished up the dusting. We finished up the fipronil grain application. We ultimately ended up getting to 15,650 acres of prairie dogs. And I'll get to how many individuals that is later. So we had met our 12,500 acres, which is really what the ferrets needed and really where they were in their surrounding areas. And superseded that by about 3,000 acres. So that was pretty cool. We did end up with 2,500 acres. Here we go. Impacted from plague. So we lost 2,500 acres of prairie dogs too. And ultimately the translocation crew moved 749 imperiled prairie dogs out of those boundary management areas where they were slated to be poisoned anyways, and into the key ferret areas that had just plagued out. So that was a new tactic. Dean Biggins had kind of always said, if you're going to put prairie dogs back in an area, just make sure you manage the area. If you're going to put prairie dogs back in an area that had just plagued, just make sure you manage the flea load first. We didn't really need to manage the flea load for a year or anything, but you needed to manage the flea load period. So we did that. And then we went at it. And the black-footed ferrets, their spotlighting and their vaccination continued as well. They spent almost 1,600 hours spotlighting in their field season this year. So it was a larger effort than usual. They surveyed over 20,000 acres, and they found 92 adult ferrets and 148 kits. 6 more black-footed ferrets that were not identified, and that brought the total population to about 246. And I'll put that number into comparison with you for other years, but like 246 ferrets was pretty awesome, actually. You can see back to that 355 number, back in 2007 and 2008 before we had plague, and it really plummeted, but then it had really been climbing up. And 2024 was a great year for pup production and prairie dog recruitment range wide, probably based on 23's precip. So 246 was a pretty good number. And then, so I've really kind of shared with you the mitigation via via dusting and fipronils. And now I wanted to share via plague mitigation via translocation. And what did that look like? Travis just said, I want you guys to trap as many prairie dogs as possible and plant them in these key spots as much as possible. So can we use translocation not only to, save individual prairie dogs and augment colonies, but can we use it as a tool to mitigate sylvatic plagues impact too? So what we're really looking for when we do a translocation is establishment. We want to trap our prairie dogs and then release them into a colony where they can reestablish themselves as an active colony. And what we kind of define as establishment is, do we have individuals still on site? Are they reproducing? And were they able to maintain that footprint or perimeter that we put them into? And this year for our research, we decided to look at, can we compare release methods in hard release methods and soft release methods to see if the prairie dogs had more fidelity or preferred certain burrows more that were either released into a hard burrow or a soft burrow. And I'll explain that in a sec. And then overall, we're really looking at, can we use these translocation methods on other landscapes, on other colonies? Could we scale it up a bit? And can we make it, easy for other managers to reproduce? I'm just going to this is way more involved and intricate than we have time for today. But the methods that we use on our take site are, we assess the colonies, we map all the different coteries, we GPS all the different coteries, and we lay these traps out in a cluster trapping like way. So each colony each coterie will estimate, how many prairie dogs we think are there based on visual counts. And then we'll go back and put that many traps right around their main active burrows in each coterie area, which is, analysis, observation, and a little bit of a guessing game and trusting your intuition too. We mostly get it right, but not always. And we put a couple extra traps in each of our, main trap burrows, because some fail and some of them sometimes collect or catch or trap, non-target species as well, mostly birds and some rabbits. Then we move into active trapping. The longer your pre-bait period is and the better it's managed, the better and quicker your active trapping can be. And then after a few days of active trapping, when we start to see our numbers decline again, we'll go ahead and rest the site, lock everything open, reset it, and go back in a couple days later. On the release site, we do the same thing. We map our colonies, and we stick a garden tube down all of those burrows you can see in the background. We stick a garden tube marked off in 1 foot increments and measure the depth of all of the burrows that we can get to. And we write how many feet is on each burrow on a wooden stake. And we try to let me back up a little bit. We measure the depth of all the burrows, and we really try and say, do these burrows meet our release criteria? Are they a minimum of 3 feet or longer? And, are they not collapsible? Are they a minimum width of about 4 inches wide? Can I get my hand down it, my fist down it with a glove on? And then we decided that we were going to continue our research efforts with the hard and soft release. So we needed an equal number of hard release burrows and an equal number of soft release burrows. The soft release burrows were getting these acclimation cages that you see being installed in this picture here, and they were being inserted into the burrows and held into the burrows with that black tube that you see in the background as well. And then we installed our traps on each burrow pair. We had an equal number of soft release and hard release burrows. And we released in coteries to the best of our ability. I'll show you why that's hard sometimes. And then, like I said, we had an equal number of prairie dogs also released into the hard burrows and the soft burrows. So this is where it gets a little complicated, but not really. But it is a puzzle, and you really have to work with what the release site gives you. So on the right, you'll see where it says HEC Table A, and that's our release site. And these are all these burrows that I just described that we were going and analyzing and marking. So we have each of these lines indicate a release pair. So C22 is a hard burrow on the right under HEC Table West, the top left polygon there. C22 is a hard release burrow, and C22 is paired with C21, which is a soft release burrow. And you can see that 21 and 22 are close to each other on the release site, just like if you go over here and look on the left, Conata A to HEC West, you can see C21 and C22. So those are our coteries. Our coteries that we had analyzed during the trap session or the trapping analysis are, we have coterie 21, we have coterie 22, we have coterie 20, and then we want to put those down together into burrows that meet criteria on the release site, 20 next to 21 next to 22, and so on. So this is what one of 3 sites looked like this year. It was a really big project this year, and I was really lucky to have a team of 9 people for about 5 weeks, and we were able to get a lot done. This is what it looks like. I put this picture of myself over there because if it looks like it's hurting to think, it is. It's really hard to get 35 prairie dogs into a certain number, the same number of hard burrows and soft burrows that are from the same coterie. So when I said we did it we released our prairie dogs in the coterie to the best of our ability, sometimes we wouldn't trap, the same number of prairie dogs from coterie 21 as 22, and we'd have to move things around a little bit. So when that came into play, we tried to keep age and sex into mind too, so that we could really have replication and similarity in all of our release pairs. Right, so this is basically what I've already shared with you, but you can see my bullet points on the left. The top one does say that each site still had about 5 prairie dogs left on the colony post-plague. So those are the number of prairie dogs that were there pre-existing to our release. And we had an equal number of hard and soft release burrows, and that each plot also had additional prairie dogs released into spare burrows after our research burrows were full. We did a great job trapping. We trapped over 749 prairie dogs in a couple weeks. That was probably a record for me. I was really happy with our success. And last year, the 2 years previously, we did not have as much trapping success as we had this year. The first year, I think we trapped 30 prairie dogs, and we went there and trained a new crew, and then they tried to implement what we had trained them, and it was just really hard. Very variables for them to implement. So we only trapped 30 prairie dogs. Next year we went back and only trapped 150 prairie dogs total, which I was also not pleased with. Sometimes I can, trap 100 prairie dogs in a day. So 150 total was also a smaller set than I wanted to work with, especially on these larger landscapes. So what we learned is that the longer pre-bait period that we could have managed, i.e., our traps are laid down in those clusters, they're locked open, and they're set with grain. And the longer we have to keep those prairie dogs getting hooked on bait, and the more regular we can just train them to keep going in those traps, the better we did when we snuck in at dawn, activated our traps, and then we were really able to get 100 plus prairie dogs in a day. So these 749 prairie dogs, I think, came out of 9 days of trapping, which is pretty phenomenal. And we captured a bunch of data from our camera traps, but it was really compromised from the bison. It was super disappointing and upsetting. And I think if we had worked on the grazing schedule better, maybe we could change this in the future. But most of our burrows had the camera traps knocked over at some point during the experiment. So that was disappointing. But they also all captured data over the 60 days that we had them set to take pictures. So we had something to work with. But the bison were a deal. This is ultimately what it looks like out there. The cameras, we randomly selected which burrows were going to get cameras. Like I said, we released an equal number of prairie dogs down each burrow in each pair of hard and soft release burrows. And the majority of prairie dogs with cameras on them still had at least one prairie dog on it before the cameras were pulled. However, we did experience no difference between the hard release and the soft release burrows, i.e., the burrows with acclimation cages on them, which was the soft release, had the same amount of prairie dogs on them and the same amount of burrows with prairie dogs on them as burrows released into a soft burrow with no acclimation cage. This is what it looks like on the soft release with the acclimation cage. You can see there's a visiting prairie dog kind of in the front. That's always interesting. And on the left, you can see a prairie dog up with a burrow with a hard release. And in the way background to the right there, you can see two prairie dogs up. They're actually in an acclimation cage. So our cameras did collect a lot of data. We had so many pictures like this, which is a relief and a great sign that it's working. This is what it looked like 60 days post-release. So you're still seeing prairie dogs out there. You're still seeing them, being captured by our cameras. The stakes have blown over by now by who knows what, but the prairie dogs are on the cameras. So that's great. Ultimately, we found, were we successful at trapping and releasing as many prairie dogs as possible? Yes, that pre-bait period was good. Also, what was really good is those burrows that we were releasing prairie dogs into were natural abandoned burrows with very good structural integrity. So that just made it easier for the prairie dogs. We weren't, installing and releasing into artificial burrows. And our perimeter mapping will tell us if they stuck into their footprint, which will come in 25. How were we at collecting data on release methods for burrow fidelity? As I shared, we were able to ascertain that there was no difference between hard and soft fidelity to burrows being released into, and that the majority of the burrows we put prairie dogs down into with cameras on them still had at least one prairie dog on it before the cameras were pulled at 60 days. And are these methods replicable? Yes, with pre-existing burrows, that's, very, very easy to work with. And then, could we make the coterie mapping and analysis easier? Yes, we think we could do that with a grid to simplify the effort. So colony establishment, was our translocation a success? Again, we're looking for perimeter boundaries, individuals on site, and recruitment, and that are, indicators of success overall for our plague management. Really what Travis is looking for is a continued presence of prairie dogs in areas that were treated. What we're seeing in 25 so far, it's just, we kind of got out there a little bit earlier this year. I'm not there. I'm actually not going back this year. I'm just going to go look, but I'm not going to work. I'm moving on to a different site. But prairie dogs are up on all three of our release sites. Prairie dogs with pups are not above ground yet. So we don't know about recruitment. And Travis said he would do backflips if we had 246 black-footed ferrets. So that's kind of what we're looking for individuals. That's what we're looking for individual ferret numbers. How did we do overall? We still have prairie dogs and we still have ferrets. This is a little bit of what it looked like on the ground. If we're starting in the bottom left with Heck Table West, that was one of the most productive black-footed ferret areas. So that's really where Travis could take people if he knew he wanted to see a ferret and trap some ferrets. He could, always go down to Heck Table West. He could go down to Agate, which was that purple sign in the top right, the light lavender colors, and then Sage Creek. Heck Table West and Sage Creek, the two left and middle spots, are really where we focused our relocation efforts this year. We moved 316 dogs from a boundary management area on the Forest Service from Conata to Heck Table West, and then 329 prairie dogs from Agate into Sage Creek. And those are the two release sites that had our camera traps as well. We also moved another, about 100 prairie dogs from Roberts. If you can see that blue colony up top, the blue colony is Badlands National Park, and that white private land right above it is cropland. So the biologists there are always trying to reduce density along the perimeter of that colony. Roberts is one of the most famous prairie dog colonies around. There's always prairie dogs up, and people love to go and watch them there in the park. We, have been studying that and moving prairie dogs out of there pretty regularly. So when I say that, I mean annually. And those prairie dogs got moved to the other side of Heck Table East, and that wasn't a part of our research colony, but it was a part of our translocation colony. That plague management that we were able to implement on those 15,650 acres, I think it's 15 prairie dogs per acre is what we estimated this year, really let us know that we could get to about 234,750 prairie dogs treated to prevent a plague epizootic from affecting them, plus their associates. So anything else in their burrows likely was positively impacted by our treatment as well. So after this, this year's final push in this study, we felt like we could successfully say that translocation was a successful tool for preventing colony collapse, for augmenting these conservation colonies, which we have here and many other places we all know of, for creating connectivity. If we have, colonies that are not expanding as quickly as we want, or we really want to join up a different colony further, with stepping stones and create stepping stones to, what's the word? If we really want to create colonies with stepping stones to join two different larger colonies to make a bigger complex for black-footed ferrets, we feel like we can plant and establish prairie dog colonies as stepping stones in between two different colonies to create those complexes. We've seen that work in a couple different spots now, including Conata Basin. Reducing conflict in those boundary management areas is always important for any conservation. Reducing conflict is important. And then ultimately in the translocation, what we found is that, these good quality release burrows that we had to work with made a big difference. And that we could use translocation for all of these spots that we know of that hasn't rebounded. We kind of all have a spot that we know hasn't rebounded post-plague. Translocation could help there. And for 24, it looks like our effort has paid off. Ultimately, what all of this has told us is that we have to have prairie dog habitat actively maintained, protected, and in some areas restored via translocation or habitat. So our next steps, we got to hang out with Miss South Dakota. Our next steps are really sharing what we learned, even with people like Miss South Dakota. She's great, and she has NatureNet online. You can check out her Instagram. Joelle Peterson, and she is into black-footed ferrets, which is fascinating and fabulous. So thank you, Joelle. And she, helped tell our story, but we're also creating comprehensive reports. We're thinking about publishing, maybe our translocation piece, maybe some of the other plague mitigation work, increasing the surveillance on the ground. That's something Travis had been wanting to do, and that's Travis on the right, by the way. And then really continuing these discussions on, is the way that we responded the best? Could it be prevented? What should we do to prevent this in the future? Are there any colonies without plague anymore? Those are the kind of, talks we're kind of having in between our field seasons. And how can we create action plans for sites when epizootics are expected? Super grateful to everybody, the Forest Service, the Park Service, all of the NGOs, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, and these zoos. They are really great because they are who helps breed the black-footed ferrets in captivity that are released back into the wild each year. And they've become obviously just an instrumental part of the translocation and reintroduction efforts for black-footed ferrets. Black-footed Ferret Safe, Saving Animals from Extinction. They just did a fundraiser for right now too, so we could replicate these efforts in 25, even with the loss of some of this federal funding that we had experienced. So really grateful to all of those zoos who are part of this work. And then, as of early January, I think we had totaled that we had spent about $1 million on that emergency response effort. This is a thank you slide for the Animal Welfare Institute. They gave us a grant to contribute to this effort, and we are really grateful to them. We had a lot of fun, if you can tell. It's just a lot of great people, a lot of hard work, super meaningful, and being able to see prairie dogs still on the ground and ferrets still on the ground is what we're out there for. Okay. There you go. If we need some prompts, I got some questions. Thank you, Lindsay.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you so much.
We have a question here in the chat, and then I saw a hand up as well there. So Katrina's asking, how do you mitigate non-target effects of pesticides on prairie arthropods?
So far we have found that some of the arthropods do die on site from the deltamethrin. Some do not, but they have been rebounding and not deleterious to their populations in those specific locations. They have been coming back. So that's where we are. But the Fitbits would be an improvement, we think. And so Randy Matchett with Fish and Wildlife Service has really been working hard over the last 4 or 5 years to get that going.
And there's another chat question. How effective are vaccination and dusting?
So there is a sylvatic plague vaccination. It hasn't been that great. We were hoping it was going to be the silver bullet that we were looking for, and it's had varied results for so many reasons, mostly because every batch that you make, kind of goes through a different set of variables. So that environment has been tried to be controlled more. And then also the way that you put the bait out, which is also where the vaccine is uptake from, is as a bait put into the burrows. And this is for prairie dogs, also gets out there and gets put onto the ground and into the prairie dogs a lot differently. Also, it's just kind of like the whole herd health, analysis, right? Like, or whole herd health immunization, like only some of I think it was mostly the adult females were eating most of the bait. So it was like, you're having all the adult females get vaccinated, but then what about that year's young? So you were having to vaccinate twice a year. So it wasn't as awesome as we want, but they are still working on it. And I think some sites, maybe Colorado does almost only sylvatic plague vaccinations on their prairie dog colonies. And Dan Tripp has some great work there. So he's probably the better person to ask. But I would say it's okay. I think, what we found is that vaccines can maintain a colony, but really not individuals on the colony. So you could still have a colony and prevent collapse with vaccines, but you're going to have less density. Dust is by far the premier superior tool so far.
And Shami, I think I see your hand up there.
Thanks, Lindsay. And Lindsay,
oh yeah, thank you. Hold on, Sham. Tino Jackson was just mentioning that the vaccination for the ferrets is very effective, and that is actually totally true. I was going to mention that. Thank you. Okay, Sham.
Lindsay, great presentation, very thoughtful and awesome field work that you've done over 3 years and with your team. And just curious, at the onset of that research, the idea was to also be able to incentivize federal land management agencies such as the Forest Service and Badlands to potentially utilize translocations as opposed to lethal control of prairie dogs. It tends to be cheaper to lethally control, but if we can incentivize them to relocate and to expand, as you've described so well, prairie dog habitat. Have there been some cost benefit analysis, and what are the land management agencies thinking in terms of potentially using this for future management, this approach?
So we have stayed pretty local, and I haven't really expanded that out yet. I just finished my report a couple months ago. So I gave that to Travis and Dave from Prairie Wildlife Research and USGS, and I think we'll look at now, can we publish something? Is there something in there that's publishable, for these translocation efforts? And then I think we'll have more of an outreach and conversation from there. At Badlands, I think they felt like the coterie mapping and the colony mapping was intense. and putting the same coterie in the same burrows, was maybe too much than they had time for. So that's why we talked about putting everything on a grid. Everything from A1 goes to A1 on the release site. And you probably wouldn't be that off or that different from the coteries. We do it by coteries because that's an 8 to us at this point, right? But I think the grid would work and make it easier for everyone. So where we started at Badlands and Conata, I think they're interested. And, we put dogs also at Conata East, and did it even, more of a soft release than a hard release. I'm sorry, did more of a hard release than a soft release. And that worked too. So I think a lot's still going to come in, finishing analyzing the data and the reports and seeing what we can get out there. We didn't talk about incentivizing it. We talked about making it possible. How could we just make it possible? And maybe the incentive would come through that. And I have not done a budget analysis, but I do know that, we weren't spending that much money. It was affordable. Translocation was affordable for the grants that we received and for our budget, which is not that big. So thanks for asking.
Thank
Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions from folks? I think you had some talking points, Lindsey. Was there anything else that you wanted to sort of talk about? Maybe I know talking to some people, the effects of your current government down there on ferrets and prairie dogs is quite significant. And so maybe talking about how that might change how you're looking at things this year.
Oh my gosh. I mean, anybody can chime in on this. I think I keep saying we, but it's mostly Travis and the people on the ground in Conata Basin and at the park, in this specific spot. But we did do an emergency fundraiser to raise money for funds that had been put on hold and that were not going to be released potentially. And we were able to have a really successful fundraiser. And that goes to Shammy and myself, and I don't know who else is on this call, but really World Wildlife Fund led the effort on that and did a great job. Buffalo Nation's Grassland Alliance, Prairie Wildlife Research, all these kind of same players in the area have really worked hard to raise a significant amount of money over the last few months to get those same prairie dogs protected, so that they wouldn't not have plague mitigation in 25. So that was successful. Plus some of those funds have been released now. So it looks like there's at least this year, 25 will be okay, but not range wide. So I think efforts are still underway to make sure we disperse the money to the right places now. And I think we're nervous about the next 4 years, right? In conservation, and if funding is going to be coming and going and stopping and starting or not at all. And, are we all going to have less money to spend just from a reflection of our economy? It's like, I haven't talked to anybody else about this, but I feel like I look at these spots and think this is going to be a 4-year duration, but maybe take 10 years or more to recoup what we lose during this time. And we won't be able to recoup it all, right? Like some things you just can't replace. I doubt Debbie Downer. Hi, Cliff.
No Debbie Downers allowed. And you've got such a lovely smile and a great presentation. And you work around the obstacles, right?
Yes.
So we are resourceful. So all I would say is, what are you looking at those low-hanging fruits areas where you said you're not going back to Conata this year, but where are those next places that do have that kind of bringing people together to get something done?
I just got back from New Mexico and I went and looked at the areas at the Sylvatic National Wildlife Refuge and the areas of prairie dogs occupying, outside of Santa Fe and the Galisteo Basin and Taos and this, kind of beautiful, more desertified grassland out there that had been home to significant prairie dog populations. And they had, after 10 years of translocation into the Sylvatic National Wildlife Refuge, were ready to hang their hat up and say, we're not making this stick. This hasn't been working. And they are talking about mostly Gunnison's prairie dogs in this part of New Mexico. And bringing black-tailed prairie dogs back in New Mexico has also been a feat. And I found that to be really sad. And I'm heavy with that information because it feels to me like these lands are more desertified and less productive than they have been in the past. And that reintroduction for Gunnison's prairie dogs in this part of their range is maybe not an option. And so I feel like we're losing part of their range, and we're losing potentially a conflict management tool and a non-lethal management tool and a conservation tool. And we're talking a lot amongst ourselves and trying to figure out, can we go back and try different methods and see if that would work? And do we have a new set of more stringent criteria for our release sites? And are those less available? And I think the answer is yes. I'm not sure if we're giving up overall down there or just on, but a few sites, but that was a lot of effort that those, folks had, and a lot of science had gone into restoring that area that is not an option anymore and will fall off the map, if not already. So I think I'm going to go hang out there for a while. I'm not sure I'd call it a low-hanging fruit, Cliff, but I'm feeling called.
Okay. I'm glad you're feeling called. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Good. Are there any more questions from folks? Last call. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. Yeah, it was really informative, and thanks for sharing your passion. And yeah, that it was an amazing job and the feat that you guys took on, Herculean, as you said. Yeah, so thank you for everything. And I know there's some people on the call I see that were also involved. So yeah.
Yes, they're amazing. I just get to go, but they often tell me what to do.
Great. Yeah, so keep an eye on our newsletter. We may have one more webinar coming up this season. Otherwise, we'll be back with our webinars in the fall. Yeah, and I hope everybody has a wonderful summer and you can get out and enjoy some of that really special time out on the prairie. All right.
Thanks, Lindsey. Bye, everybody. Email me with questions.